Hi, I'm Ruben Navarrette. I'm joined by Arnold Torres. This is the Latino Paradox. Our question this week: does language, specifically the ability to speak Spanish, make you a better Latino? This is something that, Arnold, I think we have wrestled with for many years and many generations. It is no surprise that Latinos, particularly Mexican Americans, which represent really the lion's share of that population, about 70% of the whole, are insecure. And one of the things we're insecure about is language. What do you think, Arnold? Do you need to speak Spanish to be an authentic Latino?
Well, I think, as we always ask the questions, who are we in that context? The data tells us that we're a population that is not speaking Spanish as much as we did before. It's talking about the fact, the data tells us that second and third and fourth generation now are speaking English first. That's the first language. That runs contrary to the image that everybody has about us. And data keeps telling us, the most recent one being Pew, that there's a tremendous amount of confusion amongst the young about the language. They don't know much of it. What they know is, as it said, they know it clunky. They come out with words that are kind of cut in between. Right. So I think that we are a population that is going through a transition and is not sure about that transition now. And I think the element of not welcoming us is in fact even more causing greater confusion and causing a greater amount of conflict.
In terms of who we are, I agree with you. Those things you've said, I also would add, we are basically insecure. We are people, particularly Mexican Americans, as I said, who living in the United States, we're seen as Mexicans. We're seen as the other. We're not particularly welcomed oftentimes. On the other hand, when we go to Mexico, we're not welcomed for a different reason. We're seen as American. And you talk about a paradox. There's your paradox. We're people without a country. It is fed an insecurity, a sense that we don't know who we are, where we belong. Language plays into that. And at its most destructive phase, it's been an opportunity for Latinos to attack one another, which is not something we should be doing because we often get attacked from the outside. Certainly, we don't need to do more of it. The second question we wrestle with, Arnold, is first one is always, as we said, who are we? The second one is, what do we want? So in this case, I think what we want is to be able to speak whatever language we feel comfortable speaking. And we want to be free to speak Spanish at home, or even in some cases in the workplace when it helps us do our job better. As in my case, being a journalist, if you're a government worker and you have to deal with people at a desk who are Latino and that you need to speak Spanish, all the better. If you're a policeman, if you're a doctor, a nurse, all those things are important to have that language ability. So we want to be free to speak whatever language we need to speak without being judged or thought somehow less than. What do you think?
I think we're very conflicted. I think that you're absolutely right. At least the second and third and fourth generation, maybe the third and fourth more so, really are in an English language world now. It's English. But I think that they begin to see the fact that there's a side of them that's missing. When you still have Spanish language radio, you still go to different community events, you go to different places, Spanish is still being spoken. You have the criticism now that you don't speak enough Spanish, so you're not making the connection. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place. That new generation is damned if we do and almost damned if we don't. And I think this is the worst thing for us. It really is creating a tremendous amount of confusion, and it's in some cases it's creating almost a backlash on our part. And what we want is, as you say, we want to just fit. I think like any human being, we want to fit. But we're that population that is so still so related to being in proximity to Mexico, to Central America, and I think that is the confusion, the conflict that we're having.
The last question is always, what are we doing wrong? What do you think we're doing wrong as a strategy? I would say that one of the things we're doing wrong is too much infighting, as I said before, too much of a cultural litmus test, the idea that we are the only one true arbiter as to who's authentically Latino. It's a joke in our community that typically the folks who play that game the hardest and the roughest are the ones who speak Spanish not so good. The worse their Spanish is, the more intolerant they are. That's the joke. So I think we do too much of the infighting and that kind of intergroup competition. But we also, I think, have not done a good enough job of just picking one lane and staying in it. I have a lot of respect for people who do content in my business in Spanish, only in Spanish. And I have respect for people who do content only in English. I have less respect for people who try to have their cake and eat it too and do it in both languages. Here's why. It confuses the reader, it confuses the market, it confuses the people who produce the content to think that every single time I write a column, I should do it in English and Spanish, or if I do a radio show, I should do it in English and Spanish. And while that's not a demand that's made on other people in my business, the day that they ask George Will to do a column, you know, in 2 languages, or Charles Krauthammer to do a column in 2 languages, then I'll go along. But somehow I think we put this burden on ourselves, and it's one of the things that we're doing wrong.
Well, one of the things that I think we're doing wrong is that we're responding to the outside pressures too much. We're paying too much attention to that outside pressure. I understand that it's very difficult to ignore it, but I do believe that language is very much tied to the culture. I believe that language is very important. Our native language is very important to speak. As an example, I went to a university where everything was taught in Spanish. Why? Because I didn't want to miss out on the language. My identity for me was language. So I knew I was born in the United States. I spoke English. That was my first language. But I also spoke Spanish at home to my grandparents, and I didn't speak it well. And I felt like I was insulting them. I felt that that was very important to communicate. I do think, Ruben, that it's important to communicate in both languages. I think there is nothing negative about that at all. It's an absolute benefit. Yeah. I think, but I've always looked at it from a healthy perspective. I've looked at it because of the generation that I am. I've never agreed that you had to speak only one. I've always felt you need to speak at least 2 at a minimum. But that argument gets lost so much because the thing that we're doing wrong is we're adamantly, as you say, oh, if you don't speak any Spanish, you're a sellout.
Right.
If you don't know enough about this history, they somehow equate not knowing enough history or language as being you're a sellout. Right. And then the other side says you don't fit in. So, you know, I think the biggest problem, Ruben, is that we don't have this discussion amongst ourselves. You know, we don't really talk about the difficulty of what it is to be Latino in the United States at this time, more so than perhaps any other time in our past.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. That introspection is necessary. I would separate the public language from the private language, and I would say that privately in your home with your family, it's important to speak 2 languages. Publicly, what I say is it's important to speak 1 language, to do your business in 1 language and only 1 language. It can be Spanish, it can be English. It shouldn't feel that somehow we're compelled to be both. It's just unfair to ask that Jorge Ramos not be taken seriously unless he can communicate and produce content in English as well as Spanish, or that I have to produce content in Spanish as well as English. It's a way that the media establishment keeps people like him and me running in circles, spending all our time trying to be culturally appropriate, while the white guy just gets to take off, just to produce content.
But that's what we have to be careful about.
I'm tired of us chasing our tail and trying to compensate for this insecurity. We should be able to separate the private language from the public language, what we do at the home versus what we do in the workplace.
Yeah, but I don't disagree with that. But here's the difference. The difference is that I've never had to chase my tail. I don't like to play their game. And that's the reality. The reality is that we always fall into the game that mainstream and majority America want us to play. And most of the time they're playing it because they're angry, because there's a resentment, there's animosity towards us. That shouldn't be the reason why we change. You know, we should transition, we should change because it makes sense. That's the difficulty. And as long as we don't use that as the motivation, that's where we're having the difficulty.
I got to stop you there. We're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us on the Latino Paradox. I'm Ruben Navarrette, and that's Arnold Torres. Until next time.